July 17, 1918, a cellar in Yekaterinburg, Russia. Just after midnight, 11 members of the Russian Imperial family stood facing a firing squad in a cramped basement room. Former Tsar Nicholas II, his wife, Alexandra, their 5 children, 4 daughters and 1 son, their family doctor, 3 loyal servants who had refused to abandon them. They had been told they were being relocated for their safety, that the approaching White Army, the anti-Bolshevik forces still loyal to the Tsar, had made it too dangerous to remain in the upper floors of the house. It was a lie. Yakov Yurovsky, the Bolshevik commandant, entered the room with 11 armed men. He read from a piece of paper, his voice flat and emotionless. Nikolai Alexandrovich, in view of the fact that your relatives are continuing their attack on Soviet Russia, the Ural Executive Committee has decided to execute you. Nicholas had time to say only one word. What? Then the shooting began. The room erupted in deafening gunfire. Bullets ricocheted off the walls. Smoke filled the cramped space. Screaming, chaos, blood. But something was wrong. The daughters wouldn't die. The soldiers kept firing, but bullets were bouncing off the girls' bodies. The executioners panicked, thinking it was divine intervention, that God was protecting the Imperial family. The truth was more tragic. The girls had sewn the family's jewelry, diamonds, rubies, emeralds, into their corsets. Pounds of precious stones hidden in their undergarments, their only remaining wealth from 3 centuries of unimaginable power. And now those jewels were acting as armor, deflecting bullets. When the smoke cleared and the screaming stopped, some of the family members were still alive, moaning in agony on the blood-soaked floor. The soldiers finished them with bayonets and rifle butts. 11 bodies, a dynasty that had ruled Russia for 304 years, gone in 17 minutes. But this wasn't just an execution, it was the violent end of one of the most powerful, tragic, and ultimately doomed bloodlines in human history. This is the story of the Romanovs. From absolute power to absolute destruction, from emperors who commanded millions to prisoners executed in a basement, this is the Romanovs, Russia's last imperial family. To understand how the Romanovs ended in that cellar, we must go back 3 centuries, back to when Russia was on the verge of collapse, back to a time of chaos and civil war, the year 1613. Russia was in ruins. For 15 years, the country had been torn apart by what historians call the Time of Troubles. The ruling dynasty, the Rurik dynasty, which had ruled since the 9th century, had died out. There was no clear heir. Rival factions fought for control. Foreign armies invaded. Polish forces occupied Moscow. Swedish armies seized territory in the north. Famine ravaged the countryside. Bandits roamed freely. The Russian state was on the verge of complete disintegration. The nobility, the boyars, knew they had to act. Without a legitimate Tsar, Russia would cease to exist as a unified nation. So, in 1613, they convened a special assembly called the Zemsky Sobor, a gathering of nobles, clergy, merchants, and military leaders from across Russia. Their task: choose a new Tsar. After weeks of deliberation, they selected a 16-year-old boy named Mikhail Romanov. He was young, politically neutral, related distantly to the old Rurik dynasty through marriage. He seemed safe, controllable. Mikhail didn't want the job. When the delegation arrived at the Ipatiev monastery where he was living with his mother, he reportedly wept and begged them to choose someone else. His mother agreed. She knew being Tsar was a death sentence. The previous years had seen multiple pretenders and false Tsars murdered, overthrown, executed. But the delegation insisted. Russia needed a Tsar, and they had chosen him. On July 22, 1613, Mikhail Romanov was crowned Tsar of all Russia in the Assumption Cathedral in Moscow. He was terrified, inexperienced, surrounded by enemies, but he survived. He stabilized the country, he made peace with Sweden and Poland, he rebuilt Moscow, and when he died in 1645, after 32 years of rule, he passed the throne to his son, Alexis. The Romanov dynasty had begun, and for the next 300 years, they would rule the largest empire on earth. The early Romanovs were not particularly remarkable. They were competent administrators who slowly rebuilt Russia after the chaos of the time of troubles. They expanded the empire eastward into Siberia. They reformed the military. They strengthened the Orthodox Church. But everything changed in 1682 when a 10-year-old boy named Peter Alexeyevich became Tsar. He would later be known as Peter the Great, and he would transform Russia from a backward, isolated kingdom into a European superpower. Peter was not supposed to be Tsar. He was the son of Tsar Alexis's second wife and had older half-brothers, but palace intrigue, political maneuvering, and a violent revolt by the palace guards, the Streltsy, resulted in Peter being named co-Tsar alongside his mentally disabled half-brother, Ivan V. Peter's half-sister, Sophia, acted as regent, effectively ruling Russia while the two boys were young. But Peter was brilliant, energetic, and ambitious. By the time he was 17, he had seized full power, sidelined his half-sister, and begun implementing radical reforms. Peter was obsessed with Western Europe. He believed Russia was backward, primitive, embarrassingly behind the advanced nations of the West. So in 1697, he did something unprecedented. He left Russia and traveled incognito through Europe for 18 months, studying shipbuilding in the Netherlands, military tactics in Prussia, governance in England. He worked as a common laborer in Dutch shipyards, learning how to build ships with his own hands. He met with scientists, engineers, military officers. He hired hundreds of Western experts to return with him to Russia. When he came back, he was determined to drag Russia into the modern world, by force if necessary. He forced the nobility to shave their beards. Beards were seen as traditional and orthodox, but Peter saw them as backward. Those who refused paid a beard tax. He forced nobles to wear Western clothing instead of traditional Russian robes. He reformed the military along European lines, creating a professional standing army. He reformed the government, replacing the old boyar council with a Western-style senate and ministries. He reformed the alphabet, simplifying Russian script. He reformed the Orthodox Church, subordinating it to the state and eliminating the position of patriarch. And most dramatically, he built an entirely new capital city from scratch. In 1703, Peter founded St. Petersburg on the swampy shores of the Baltic Sea. It was a statement. Russia was now a European power. The new capital would be a European city. Grand boulevards, classical architecture, canals modeled after Amsterdam and Venice. The construction was brutal. Tens of thousands of workers died building the city in the freezing marshes. But Peter didn't care. He needed his window to Europe. In 1721, after defeating Sweden in the Great Northern War and securing Russia's access to the Baltic Sea, Peter declared Russia an empire and himself emperor. The Romanovs were no longer just Tsars. They were emperors of the largest continuous land empire in history, stretching from Poland to the Pacific Ocean. But Peter's reforms came at a terrible cost. He was brutal, paranoid, and cruel. He personally supervised the torture and execution of rebels. He had his own son, Alexei, tortured to death for allegedly plotting against him. When Peter the Great died in 1725, he left behind a transformed Russia, powerful, modern, European, but also a country built on violence, oppression, and the absolute power of the autocrat. And that absolutism would ultimately destroy the Romanovs. After Peter the Great's death, Russia entered a period of palace coups and weak rulers. For decades, the throne passed through a series of empresses and short-lived emperors, many of whom came to power through conspiracy and assassination. But in 1762, a young German princess would seize the throne and become one of the most powerful rulers in Russian history. Her name was Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst. History would know her as Catherine the Great. Catherine was not Russian. She was born in Prussia, a minor German princess with no claim to the Russian throne. But at age 15, she was selected to marry the heir to the Russian throne, the future Peter III. It was a disaster. Peter III was mentally unstable, possibly mentally disabled, obsessed with toy soldiers, and utterly incompetent. He despised Russia and openly admired Prussia, Russia's enemy. Catherine, by contrast, was intelligent, ambitious, and determined. She learned Russian fluently. She converted to Russian orthodoxy. She cultivated relationships with powerful nobles and military officers. She read voraciously: philosophy, history, political theory, and she plotted. In 1762, just 6 months after Peter III became emperor, Catherine organized a coup. With the support of the Imperial Guard, she deposed her husband and declared herself Empress of Russia. Peter III was arrested. A week later, he was dead. Officially, he died of hemorrhoidal colic. In reality, he was almost certainly murdered, probably strangled by Catherine's allies. Catherine was now empress, and she would rule Russia for 34 years. She continued Peter the Great's work of modernizing and expanding Russia. She corresponded with Voltaire and other Enlightenment philosophers. She presented herself as an enlightened despot, a rational, progressive ruler, but in reality she was as autocratic and ruthless as any Romanov before her. She crushed a massive peasant rebellion led by Yemelyan Pugachev with extreme brutality. Pugachev was captured, brought to Moscow in a cage, and publicly executed, beheaded and quartered. She expanded the empire massively, conquering the Crimea and much of Ukraine from the Ottoman Empire, partitioning Poland with Prussia and Austria, and she took numerous lovers. Officially, she had 12 recognized favorites, men who enjoyed enormous wealth and power as long as they pleased the empress. The most famous was Grigory Potemkin, a brilliant general and statesman who helped expand Russia's southern borders. When Catherine died in 1796, she left behind an empire larger and more powerful than ever, but she also left behind a problem: her son. Paul I was everything Catherine was not. Where she was intelligent, he was erratic. Where she was politically astute, he was paranoid and unstable. Catherine had despised her son. She had considered disinheriting him and passing the throne directly to her grandson, Alexander. But she died before she could formalize this plan. So Paul became emperor. His reign was a disaster. He reversed many of Catherine's policies out of spite. He made enemies among the nobility. He became increasingly paranoid, seeing conspiracies everywhere. In 1801, after just 4 years on the throne, a group of nobles stormed his bedroom in the newly built Michael Castle and murdered him. Officially, he died of apoplexy. In reality, he was beaten and strangled with a scarf. His son, Alexander I, almost certainly knew about the plot. He may have approved it. He became emperor over his father's corpse. The Romanovs had murdered one of their own. It would not be the last time. Alexander I ruled during one of the most dramatic periods in European history, the Napoleonic Wars. In 1812, Napoleon invaded Russia with the largest army ever assembled, over 600,000 men from across his empire. At first, the invasion seemed unstoppable. Napoleon's forces swept across Russia, winning battle after battle. The Russians retreated, burning everything behind them, leaving nothing for the French to loot or forage. By September, Napoleon had captured Moscow, but the city was already burning. The Russians had set it on fire themselves. Napoleon waited in the ruins of Moscow, expecting the Russians to surrender, but they didn't. Winter came. Napoleon's army, stranded deep in Russia with dwindling supplies, began to freeze and starve. Soldiers died by the thousands. Horses were slaughtered for food. In October, Napoleon ordered the retreat. It became a death march. Of the 600,000 men who had invaded Russia, fewer than 100,000 made it back. Russia had survived, and Alexander I was hailed as the savior of Europe. But Alexander became increasingly religious and mystical. He believed God had chosen him to defeat Napoleon. He became obsessed with Christianity and apocalyptic prophecy. In 1825, Alexander died suddenly while visiting the southern city of Taganrog. There were rumors he had faked his death and become a wandering monk. To this day, historians debate whether he truly died or vanished. What followed was chaos. Alexander had no children. His younger brother, Constantine, was next in line but had secretly renounced his claim. The next brother, Nicholas, was supposed to inherit but didn't know this officially. For 3 weeks, Russia had no clear Tsar. Both brothers refused to take the throne, each insisting the other was the rightful emperor. Finally, Nicholas agreed to become Tsar, and on the day of his coronation, December 26, 1825, a group of young officers attempted a coup. They were called the Decembrists. They wanted constitutional monarchy, an end to serfdom, political reform. They believed Russia could not continue as an absolute autocracy. 3,000 soldiers gathered in Senate Square in St. Petersburg, refusing to swear allegiance to Nicholas. They demanded Constantine as Tsar and a constitution. Nicholas responded with force. He ordered artillery to fire grape shot into the crowd. The square became a massacre. Dozens were killed, hundreds wounded. The leaders of the revolt were arrested. 5 were hanged. Over 100 were exiled to Siberia. Nicholas I would rule for 30 years, and he would be one of the most reactionary, repressive tsars in Russian history. He created a secret police force, the Third Section, to hunt down revolutionaries. He censored newspapers and books. He crushed any hint of dissent. Russia became known as the gendarme of Europe, the enforcer of conservatism and autocracy. But repression only bred more resistance, and that resistance would eventually destroy the Romanovs. Nicholas I died in 1855 during the Crimean War, a humiliating defeat that exposed Russia's backwardness compared to Western European powers. His son, Alexander II, realized Russia had to change or collapse. In 1861, Alexander issued the Emancipation Manifesto, freeing Russia's serfs, peasants who had been essentially slaves, bound to the land and their noble masters for centuries. It was the most dramatic reform in Russian history. 23 million people were freed. But it wasn't enough. The serfs were technically free, but they received little land and remained desperately poor. Revolutionary movements grew, terrorist groups formed, dedicated to assassinating government officials and the Tsar himself. For 20 years, revolutionaries tried to kill Alexander II. Multiple assassination attempts failed. But on March 13, 1881, they finally succeeded. Alexander was riding in his carriage through St. Petersburg when a terrorist threw a bomb. The first bomb missed. Alexander stepped out of his carriage to check on the wounded. That's when a second terrorist threw another bomb. It landed at Alexander's feet. The explosion shattered his legs. He was carried back to the Winter Palace, bleeding to death. His son, the future Alexander III, watched his father die on the floor, his legs mangled beyond recognition. Alexander II, the Tsar liberator who had freed the serfs, was assassinated by the very revolutionaries he had tried to appease. And his death convinced his son of one thing: reform was weakness. Alexander III reversed his father's policies. He increased repression. He strengthened autocracy. He persecuted minorities, especially Jews, leading to waves of violent pogroms. He ruled with an iron fist, and he died of kidney failure in 1894 at just 49 years old. His son, Nicholas II, became Tsar. He was 26 years old, intelligent but weak-willed, deeply religious but politically naive. He believed God had chosen him to rule Russia as an absolute autocrat. He would be the last emperor of Russia, and his reign would end in revolution, civil war, and execution. Nicholas II ascended to the throne in 1894, determined to preserve autocracy exactly as his father had left it. "I shall maintain the principle of autocracy just as firmly and unflinchingly as it was preserved by my unforgettable dead father," he declared. "It was a catastrophic mistake." Russia in the 1890s was changing rapidly. Industrialization was transforming cities. A new working class was emerging in factories. Revolutionary ideas, socialism, Marxism, anarchism, were spreading among workers and intellectuals. But Nicholas refused to adapt. He believed any concession to constitutional government would be a betrayal of his divine duty as Tsar. In 1894, Nicholas married Princess Alix of Hesse-Darmstadt, a German princess and granddaughter of Britain's Queen Victoria. Alix converted to Russian Orthodoxy and took the name Alexandra Feodorovna. She was beautiful, deeply religious, and completely devoted to Nicholas. They were genuinely in love, a rarity among royal marriages. But Alexandra was also anxious, neurotic, and increasingly isolated. She distrusted Russian society. She believed everyone was plotting against her husband, and she became obsessed with mysticism and faith healing. Together, Nicholas and Alexandra would have 5 children, 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and finally, in 1904, a son. His name was Alexei, and he was the heir to the Russian throne. But Alexei was doomed from birth. He had inherited hemophilia, a genetic blood disorder that prevents blood from clotting properly. Any injury, even a minor bruise, could cause internal bleeding that might kill him. Hemophilia ran in European royal families, passed down through Queen Victoria. It was called the royal disease. Alexandra was a carrier. She had passed it to her son. For Alexandra, this was a source of unbearable guilt and terror. Her son, the future Tsar, could die at any moment from a simple fall or cut. She became desperate to save him. She prayed constantly. She sought out faith healers and mystics, and that's how she met Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin was a peasant from Siberia. He was illiterate, crude, and claimed to have mystical healing powers. In 1905, he was introduced to the Imperial family. When Alexei suffered a severe bleeding episode, Rasputin was brought to the palace. Somehow, Rasputin seemed to help. Whether through hypnosis, calming presence, or sheer luck, Alexei's condition improved when Rasputin was present. Alexandra became convinced Rasputin was a holy man sent by God to save her son. From that moment on, Rasputin had enormous influence over the Empress, and through her, over the Tsar. Rasputin's power grew. He influenced government appointments. He meddled in politics. He was protected by the Empress no matter what scandals surrounded him. And there were many scandals. Rasputin drank heavily. He was sexually promiscuous. Rumors spread that he was sleeping with noble women, possibly even the Empress herself. The nobility hated him. They saw him as a corrupting influence, a peasant manipulating the imperial family. But Nicholas and Alexandra refused to dismiss him. They believed he was keeping Alexei alive, and so Rasputin remained, a symbol of the Romanovs' disconnection from reality. In 1905, Russia suffered a humiliating defeat in the Russo-Japanese War. It was the first time a European power had been defeated by an Asian nation. The defeat sparked a revolution. On January 22, 1905, a day known as Bloody Sunday, thousands of workers marched peacefully to the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg to present a petition to the Tsar asking for better working conditions and political reform. Nicholas wasn't even there. He was at his summer palace, but the Imperial Guard opened fire on the unarmed crowd. Hundreds were killed, thousands wounded. The massacre ignited a revolution. Strikes erupted across Russia. Peasants seized land. Sailors mutinied on the battleship Potemkin. Nicholas was forced to make concessions. In October 1905, he issued the October Manifesto, promising a constitution and an elected parliament, the Duma. It was the first time in 300 years that the Romanovs had agreed to share power. But Nicholas never truly accepted it. He saw the Duma as an annoyance, something to be tolerated but undermined at every opportunity. The revolution was suppressed, but the anger remained. In 1914, Europe plunged into war, World War I. Russia mobilized to defend its ally, Serbia, against Austria-Hungary. Within weeks, all the major European powers were at war. Nicholas believed the war would unite Russia. That patriotic fervor would silence the revolutionaries. He was catastrophically wrong. The Russian army was massive, millions of soldiers, but it was poorly equipped, badly led, and unprepared for modern industrial warfare. In August 1914, at the Battle of Tannenberg, 2 entire Russian armies were destroyed by Germany. 170,000 Russian soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured in a matter of days. It was one of the worst military defeats in history, and it was just the beginning. For 3 years, Russia bled. Millions of soldiers died. Millions more deserted. The economy collapsed. Food shortages spread. Cities faced starvation. And in 1915, Nicholas made his most disastrous decision. He went to the front to personally command the army. This meant leaving Alexandra in charge of the government in St. Petersburg. Alexandra, who trusted no one. Alexandra, who relied on Rasputin for advice on everything from military strategy to government appointments. The government became a revolving door of incompetent ministers chosen because Rasputin approved of them. The nobility was horrified. Russia was losing the war, the economy was collapsing, and the empress was taking advice from a drunken peasant mystic. Something had to be done. On the night of December 30th, 1916, a group of nobles decided to murder Rasputin. They lured him to the Yusupov palace with the promise of meeting a beautiful woman. Prince Felix Yusupov, one of the richest men in Russia, served Rasputin tea and cakes laced with cyanide. Rasputin ate them, and nothing happened. The poison should have killed him instantly, but Rasputin seemed unaffected. Panicking, Yusupov shot Rasputin in the chest. Rasputin collapsed. The conspirators left the room thinking he was dead. But minutes later, Rasputin stood up. He attacked Yusupov, then stumbled outside into the snow, trying to escape. The conspirators shot him 3 more times. They beat him with clubs. They threw his body into the freezing Neva River. When his body was recovered, the autopsy revealed water in his lungs. He had still been alive when he hit the water. He had drowned. Rasputin was dead, but it was too late to save the Romanovs. By early 1917, Russia was on the brink of collapse. In Petrograd, as St. Petersburg was now called, bread lines stretched for blocks. Workers were starving. Soldiers were mutinying. On March 8, 1917, International Women's Day, female textile workers in Petrograd went on strike, demanding bread. The strike spread. Within days, hundreds of thousands of workers and soldiers joined the protests. The Tsar ordered the army to suppress the demonstrations, but the soldiers refused. They joined the protesters instead. Within a week, the entire government collapsed. The Duma declared a provisional government. The army abandoned the Tsar. Nicholas was at military headquarters hundreds of miles from Petrograd. His generals informed him that the situation was hopeless. The army would not support him. The government had abandoned him. On March 15, 1917, Nicholas II abdicated the throne. 304 years of Romanov rule ended with the stroke of a pen. Nicholas abdicated on behalf of himself and his son. He knew Alexei's hemophilia meant he could never rule. He tried to pass the throne to his brother, Grand Duke Mikhail, but Mikhail wisely refused. There would be no more Tsars. The Romanovs were no longer emperors. They were prisoners. The provisional government placed the imperial family under house arrest at the Alexander Palace outside Petrograd. Nicholas seemed almost relieved. He wrote in his diary that he felt a weight had been lifted. He could finally spend time with his family without the burden of ruling. But the situation was deteriorating rapidly. In November 1917, the Bolsheviks, radical Marxist revolutionaries led by Vladimir Lenin, seized power in Petrograd. Russia descended into civil war. The Bolshevik Red Army fought against the anti-Bolshevik White Armies. Millions would die. The Bolsheviks saw the Romanovs as a threat. As long as Nicholas and his family were alive, they could become a symbol for counter-revolutionaries. In August 1917, the family was moved to Tobolsk in Siberia, a remote town far from the fighting. The conditions were harsh but tolerable. The family lived in the governor's house. They had servants. They could walk outside. Nicholas taught his son. The daughters sewed and read. They waited, hoping the war would end and they could leave Russia. But in April 1918, the Bolsheviks moved them again, this time to Yekaterinburg, an industrial city in the Ural Mountains. They were imprisoned in the Ipatiev House, a large building that the Bolsheviks renamed the House of Special Purpose. It was a prison. Windows were painted over, guards watched constantly. The family's movements were restricted to a few rooms. The Bolsheviks were deciding what to do with them. In Moscow, Lenin and the Bolshevik leadership debated. Some wanted a public trial. Others feared that would create sympathy for the Tsar. And then, in July 1918, the White Army began advancing toward Yekaterinburg. If the Whites captured the city, they would free the imperial family. The Romanovs would become a rallying point for the anti-Bolshevik cause. Lenin and the Bolsheviks made their decision. The Romanovs had to die. On the night of July 16, 1918, the family went to bed as usual. Just after midnight, Yakov Yurovsky, the commandant, woke them. He told them the White Army was approaching and they needed to move to the basement for safety. The family dressed quickly. Nicholas carried Alexei, who was recovering from another bleeding episode and couldn't walk. They were led down to a basement room. 11 people total: Nicholas, Alexandra, their 5 children, the family doctor, and 3 servants. Chairs were brought in. Alexandra and Alexei sat, the others stood. Yurovsky and 11 armed men entered the room. Yurovsky read the execution order. Nicholas managed to say, "What?" before the shooting started. The room was small, just 12 feet by 16 feet. The noise was deafening. Smoke filled the space. Nicholas was shot first, killed instantly. Alexandra tried to cross herself but was cut down. The bullets ricocheted wildly off the walls. Several of the executioners were wounded by their own ricocheting bullets, and the daughters wouldn't die. The jewels sewn into their corsets, diamonds, pounds of them, were deflecting bullets. The executioners panicked. They thought it was a miracle, that God was protecting the girls. One executioner later described hearing screaming, seeing the girls trying to crawl away, bullets bouncing off them. When the shooting finally stopped, several family members were still alive, moaning and crying on the floor. The soldiers finished them with bayonets. Anastasia, the youngest daughter, was 17 years old. She took the longest to die. The bodies were taken to a forest outside Yekaterinburg. The Bolsheviks tried to burn them, but there wasn't enough gasoline. They buried the remains in a shallow grave, poured sulfuric acid over them to prevent identification, then reburied them under a road. For decades, the Soviet government denied the execution. They claimed Nicholas had been executed, but the family had been moved to safety. It was a lie. In 1991, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, a mass grave was discovered in the forest near Yekaterinburg. DNA testing confirmed it. 9 of the 11 victims were there, but 2 were missing: Alexei and one of the daughters, most likely Maria. In 2007, another grave was found nearby. 2 more bodies. DNA confirmed they were the missing Romanov children. In 2008, the Russian Orthodox Church formally recognized the remains as the Imperial family. In 1998, the family was reburied in the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg, the traditional burial place of Russian Tsars. 304 years after the Romanov dynasty began, it finally had its ending. But the story didn't end with the execution. Almost immediately, rumors spread that one of the daughters had survived. In the 1920s, a woman appeared in Berlin claiming to be Grand Duchess Anastasia. She called herself Anna Anderson. For decades, she insisted she was the youngest Romanov daughter. Some surviving relatives believed her. Others rejected her as a fraud. She died in 1984. DNA testing later proved conclusively she was not Anastasia. She was a Polish factory worker named Franziska Szankowska. But the legend persisted. Books were written. Movies were made. The idea that one Romanov had somehow escaped became a cultural phenomenon. The truth was simpler and more tragic. They all died. None survived. The Romanov dynasty ended in that basement in Yekaterinburg. Today, the Romanovs are remembered not as emperors but as martyrs. The Russian Orthodox Church canonized Nicholas, Alexandra, and their 5 children as passion bearers, saints who died with Christian dignity. The Ipatiev house where they were executed was demolished by the Soviet government in 1977. Today, a church stands on the site, the Church on the Blood. The Romanov palaces, the Winter Palace, Peterhof, Catherine Palace, are now museums filled with tourists marveling at the wealth and grandeur of Imperial Russia. But that grandeur was built on the backs of millions of serfs, workers, and soldiers. The Romanovs ruled Russia as absolute autocrats for over 3 centuries. They expanded the empire to become the largest in the world. They built magnificent palaces and cities. They patronized great artists, writers, and composers, but they also refused to share power. They crushed dissent. They clung to autocracy even as the world around them changed. And in the end, their refusal to reform cost them everything. 304 years. From a frightened boy crowned in a time of chaos to a family executed in a basement. The Romanovs, Russia's imperial family, power, glory, tragedy. This has been Bloodline Chronicles.